Hi class, this is Alma Gabella and I will be talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, which of course was the country that I chose to look at in regards to communism in this country, the history of communism in this country. But I will be talking about it as a part of Tito's Yugoslavia and how Tito was able to really bring a new face to communism with his non-aligned movement. So as a part of Yugoslavia, I will kind of bring in parts about Bosnia as well. So Bosnia and Herzegovina had become a part of the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia in 1945, and this was at the conclusion of World War II. Just a quick overview of Bosnia before that, just a brief history. Bosnia is actually where World War I sort of started in the capital of Sarajevo when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot, and World War I ensued very shortly after. So Bosnia at the time was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then it became a part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and then during World War II is sort of when it transitioned into becoming a communist and socialist republic. So Tito's road to this non-aligned movement and really becoming the leader of Yugoslavia and of this communist country as we came to know it, it really started during World War II. So what happened is that during World War II, Yugoslavia was really hoping for aid and assistance from the USSR. It did not receive the aid that they had continuously asked for during the war, but they were still able to kind of fight through and keep their country intact at the conclusion of World War II. So in the slide on the right hand side, you see a girl, and she became sort of a symbol. I've seen a picture of her in many different ways as far as her really being a symbol of Yugoslavia and of the Yugoslav forces, which were called the partisans. She's kind of like the poster child of it. I've seen pictures of her in many different forms. And on the bottom left-hand corner there, you see a banner that says Smrt fašizmu, sloboda narodu, which means death to fascism, liberty to the people. So the people of Yugoslavia really started to think of themselves as being able to stand on their own 2 feet without having to look to the USSR for aid or even to be, affiliated with the USSR in that regard. And it really gave the people of Yugoslavia this heightened sense of nationalism, and that nationalism went far beyond religious and ethnic divides. So the 3 dominant religions in the region are Christian Orthodox, Muslim, and Catholic. So these people really kind of felt a new heightened sense of unity after World War II because they fought together against fascist forces, against German occupation, without the help of the USSR. So it's important to kind of highlight that because Tito was able to use that as a sticking point to why he wished to separate from the USSR. Of course, the people of Yugoslavia had already seen sort of Stalin's grievances. They've witnessed them, the mass executions, the very, very aggressive ways he dealt with people that he deemed were enemies of him, of the party. And so he really became obviously like a symbol of this negative thing for people in Yugoslavia. And then on top of that, they did not feel that he was there to support and to help them during the Second World War. I apologize. And so, like I said, Tito was able to use those aggressions and the lack of assistance as 2 really big reasons for believing that Yugoslavia can function on its own and that it did not need the USSR, and that it actually wanted to align with something different from what the USSR represented, and that would actually become the non-aligned movement. So before talking about the movement, I do just kind of want to highlight this as I think it's a really important precursor to why Tito structured the non-aligned movement the way he did. So separating from the USSR obviously didn't come without its difficulties. So right away, the Yugoslavia was expelled from the Communist Information Bureau, so the Cominform. Then the USSR started an economic embargo to really try and heighten political pressure and then overthrow Tito, and that didn't work. And then the majority of communists, you still have to remember, were very in support of Stalin, even though they knew of his, aggressive ways of governing. But he was sort of all that they knew as a symbol for communism at the time. So Tito also had a lot of people that were sort of trying to get into, into his cabinet and then bring information back to Stalin. And that was also another one of the ways that he still tried to make sure to oust Tito. And again, it didn't take. And then Cominform then passed a resolution that would deem Yugoslavia's leadership as agents of imperialism, of capitalism, and supporters of warmongers and Gestapo-type terrorists. So everything that communist and communism were known to be against, the Cominform had now been trying to pin Yugoslavia as. So they really tried to create this vision of Yugoslavia that it was, something that was so far, far off of what communist ideals were, and that it was something really opposing to the communist ideals. And then, of course, Soviet loans were lost, and the equipment to rebuild, the infrastructure, the economy, the industries, all of that was lost. So in this slide here, you actually see a bridge that collapsed after being, attacked by German forces. It's a very well-known sort of bridge in Bosnia on the river Neretva, and things like this obviously needed to be reconstructed, but now no aid from the USSR was coming into the country. So now you are a socialist communist country in Europe, not receiving aid from the superpower that you would normally turn to kind of support you in this transition from war to peace. So this was where Tito was very, very strategic, and that's what we'll talk about in the next slide. So this is where the non-alignment movement came into being. It was formed during the Cold War, and it was largely on Tito's initiative, though representatives and leaders from different countries like India also had a large part in sort of creating this non-aligned movement, but Tito was sort of seen as one of the founders of it. And it was basically an organization of states that did not want to formally align themselves with either the US, of course, the Western Bloc, or the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc. They did not want to be political puppets of these large world powers that were willing to just use them for their own interests. These were countries that wanted to remain independent and neutral, and sort of bolster their own, economic development, third world countries. So how did Yugoslavia exercise this non-aligned movement? What did it mean for Yugoslavia? And I think it's so important to highlight Tito in this whole situation of talking about Yugoslavia, because he really was the front man of being able to maneuver through the East and the West and the perspectives of both of them, and then understand how to sort of carve out this new position for communism in Europe and what communism meant on the world stage. So he was, here you see him on the upper left-hand corner with JFK on the White House lawn with his kids as well. And then you see him here with Ethiopian leaders as well. And then on the bottom left-hand corner, you also see him with Fidel Castro in Cuba having Cuban cigars. So he really was a very well-rounded statesman. He knew how to use both the East and the West to understand how to self-manage Yugoslavia, as it didn't need to be or was not a part of the greater USSR any longer. So he, like I said, was really able to carve out this new space for what communism and socialism could mean to people across the world. So first and foremost, before he was able to really gain funding, because funding was stopped from the USSR and it wasn't coming from anywhere else in the beginning, he used what he had in Yugoslavia to begin with. So that started with reconstruction by the people. They were called youth work actions in the languages of Yugoslavia, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, whichever one you want to say. But in those languages, they were called radne akcije. And I find them to be very, very interesting because these are things that my grandparents spoke about, my husband's grandparents spoke about, our parents speak about, and what it really was youth coming together very often in the summer, as you can see, and they would really work throughout the day. And then, their stories of, them hanging out at night, having dinner and big pots of beans and all of this stuff and just having a guitar, singing, having a good time. But then really Tito was able to use, their youth and their ability to work and that free labor during the day. And I think that, in that sense, that was genius. So like Kern says in one of the academic articles that I read when reading about Tito's ability to sort of start this reconstruction process without much aid coming in, is that he would start paving the path that had not yet been trodden. And I found that to be really kind of profound. So these were voluntary labor brigades, but then he also, and of course those were used because especially the youth had this enthusiasm for reconstructing the country. But then he also was able to use forced labor by war prisoners and political enemies that he obviously got during World War II. So it was really a great way to kind of use what he had on hand, for the lack of a better term, at the time. So then came U.S. aid, and as we know, the United States won't do anything without doing it strategically. So in 1949, the U.S. actually sent its first loan to Yugoslavia. So we see Yugoslavia really using that non-aligned stance for its maximum benefit, without having to politically align with the United States and obviously not aligning with the USSR politically. It was able to use this for its own economic development. And so President Truman also sent a letter of support shortly after that first loan, and this was that cornerstone in the dealings between Yugoslavia and the United States. So like I said, in that sense, it was strategic for the US because it was keeping Soviet power out of Europe. So it was really capitalizing on that rift between Yugoslavia and the USSR. And this aid came in the form of food supplies, it came in the form of military assistance and loans. And this also allowed Yugoslavia to then have access to further loans. And that obviously then was the IMF funds that it was allowed to sort of get loans from. Then import and export grew. And at looking sort of through my research, looking at import and export, I knew that my grandfather actually owned a Yugo. I also know that my dad had one too. They were sort of the cars that everyone drove in Yugoslavia at the time. Yugoslavia obviously made them, but I didn't know that they were also sold in the US. And so this was very, very interesting to me to find a flyer. Apparently a car was $3,990, a new one back then, of course. And it was kind of funny on the bottom there it says, for the Yugo dealer nearest you, call 1-800-USA-YUGO. I think it's so important to highlight that because now you have a communist socialist country sending its cars to the United States, and that's a huge kind of cornerstone in how the world saw communism, because now this huge capitalist world power was bringing in a product from a socialist country. So Yugoslavia really paved the way for a collaboration of socialist countries with the West without having to politically align with them, and that was all thanks to this non-aligned movement. So in that sense, there was this 50-50 sphere of influence over Yugoslavia. Tito was very direct and cautious and audacious with dealing with both Stalin and Churchill, and that's what made him such an interesting statesman to me. That's what I wanted to highlight here in this presentation about this non-aligned movement and how the statesman that he was and his personality and how much it influenced one another, and his abilities to sort of use both the Eastern and the Western Bloc for the interests in his own country. Now, international recognition of communist government really, changed. Internationally, communism started to be seen not just as the way that the world saw communism under Stalin. Now there was a new face to communism with how Tito sort of structured Yugoslavia. So he really outmaneuvered agreements for an even sphere of influence from both the East and the West over Yugoslavia, respectively. So then, to wrap this up, the anti-aligned movement or the non-aligned movement is still out there today, but it's not, a formal movement the way it was during the time of Tito, especially like in the 60s, 70s, and then early 80s. Now, when I try to sort of research it, I find it under the website of the UN General Assembly. So it is still around and there is still membership states, but it's not structured the same way as it was before. So it's still comprised of nations that don't want to, be passive objects of global division. So even though there is, like now we obviously don't have Eastern and Western blocs, but this non-aligned movement is still something that sort of speaks to countries that are looking for economic development and that are opposed to apartheid and foreign occupation and domination. And so they sort of want to have this support system of countries and membership countries to still be able to economically develop. And so they stand together for socioeconomic development. And of course, like I said, in the 1980s, the movement faced challenges because that socialist bloc collapsed. The U.S. was obviously, still around, but not the USSR as we know it. So the non-aligned movement has now evolved to 120 member countries. And it's still intact today in efforts to promote solidarity and cooperation between developing countries, but it is part of the United Nations. So when I try to look it up now, I have to say it's very difficult to find very clear information, but it's still around. As you see there, like I said, the General Assembly of the United Nations, you even have this COVID thing, so you can see it's very, up to date. There's a summit that happened in October of last year. It's just not as, formal and clear cut as it was when there was an Eastern and a Western bloc. But this is a movement that was founded by Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito. And with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. I do apologize. I'm going to be right at 3 minutes over once I conclude. So here it is. And I want to thank you guys for listening. And I really hope everyone's hanging in there okay. Have a good one. Bye-bye.